The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with the sound of 1,000 different species trying to out-talk each other, which is about as productive as it sounds. Picture the United Nations, but with more tentacles and significantly worse breath. At the center of this diplomatic disaster sat Admiral Vex Talk, a bug-like creature whose idea of negotiation involved roughly the same subtlety as a sledgehammer to the face. The human problem, Vex Talk announced, clicking his mandibles with the enthusiasm of someone about to propose something spectacularly stupid, requires a military solution. We have tried patience. We have tried reason. Clearly these mammals respond only to force. Councillor Piperin, who looked like a jellyfish, had gotten into a disagreement with a rainbow and rippled her translucent form in what passed for diplomatic concern. Perhaps, esteemed Admiral, we should consider another round of negotiations. Surely beings capable of interstellar travel can be reasoned with. The Admiral's compound eyes practically rolled in their sockets. Reasoned with? Counselor, have you read their latest transmission? He gestured to the holographic display floating above the council chamber, where Earth's most recent message glowed in ominous red letters. Final warning. Cease all hostile activities against human colonies or we will be forced to abandon our policy of restraint. Trust us, you don't want that. The chamber erupted in what could generously be called laughter, if you're the type who finds the sound of a garbage disposal eating a kazoo orchestra amusing. Representative Glorbex, whose species had the unfortunate combination of looking like a potato and sounding like a whoopee cushion, managed to wheeze out, restraint. These are the same beings who declared war on an abstract concept and somehow won. Exactly my point. Vex Talk continued, his confidence growing with each click of his mandibles. Their threats are empty bluster. They speak of restraint while simultaneously maintaining the largest military in known space. It's clearly psychological warfare, and poorly executed at that. Piperin's form shimmered with uncertainty. But Admiral, their military records suggest a certain creativity in their approach to conflict resolution. Perhaps we should take their warning seriously. Councillor Vex Talk said with the patience of someone explaining quantum physics to a particularly slow houseplant. They claim to be operating under restraint while possessing enough firepower to glass a small moon. If they had any intention of using it, don't you think they would have done so by now? This is classic mammalian pack behavior, all bark and no bite. The council chamber murmured its agreement, because nothing builds confidence quite like a room full of beings who've never actually fought humans convincing each other that humans can't fight. It's the kind of logic that sounds brilliant right up until reality comes knocking with a baseball bat and a very unfriendly attitude. Then it's settled, Vex Talk declared, standing to his full imposing height of 4 feet 3 inches. We respond to their final warning with our own demonstration of force. A small raid on one of their mining colonies should suffice to call their bluff and demonstrate the futility of resistance. And there it was, the moment when an entire galactic civilization decided to poke the bear, metaphorically speaking. Except this particular bear had access to weapons that could turn entire star systems into expensive light shows, and a documented history of creative problem-solving that typically involved things exploding in ways that violated several laws of physics. But hey, what could possibly go wrong? Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair aboard the Earth defense ship Reasonable Response, which was named with the kind of irony that should have been a warning sign to anyone paying attention. He was reading the Galactic Council's latest diplomatic correspondence, which was about as diplomatic as a brick through a window, when his AI assistant decided to chime in with what passed for helpful commentary. Captain, Murphy announced in a tone that somehow managed to sound both cheerful and deeply concerned, I've analyzed the Council's transmission, and I'm afraid they've made what humans might call a tactical error. Morrison rubbed his temples, already feeling the headache coming on. Define tactical error, Murphy. Well, sir, they've essentially told a species that invented weapons of mass destruction as a hobby that they intend to demonstrate their superior firepower. It's rather like challenging a honey badger to a fight because you think it looks fluffy. The captain couldn't help but chuckle. Murphy had been programmed with access to Earth's entire military history, which apparently came with a healthy appreciation for irony and a deep understanding of why poking humans was generally considered a bad life choice. What's Earth Command's response? Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Admiral Hayes has authorized what he's calling a graduated diplomatic response, Murphy replied. I believe his exact words were, let's try being nice one more time, then we can stop pretending we're not really good at breaking things. Morrison pulled up the communication array and began composing what would go down in history as one of the most politely worded threats ever transmitted across the galaxy. Attention Galactic Council, he dictated. Earth acknowledges your recent communication. We would like to remind you that our previous warnings were issued out of respect for galactic peace and our genuine desire to avoid unnecessary conflict. Should I add the historical context data, sir? Murphy asked helpfully. Which historical context data? The files documenting humanity's approach to conflict resolution over the past 3,000 years, including the Great Emu War, the time humans declared war on Christmas, and that incident where humanity accidentally conquered 3-star systems while trying to deliver pizza. Morrison paused. Maybe just stick with the highlights, Murphy. Of course, sir. Transmitting now. Please be advised that Earth's military doctrine is based on the principle of proportional response. We define proportional as whatever it takes to ensure the problem doesn't happen again. Ever. We thought you should know this before you do something we'd all regret. The response from the Galactic Council came back within hours, and it was about as subtle as a supernova. They had apparently interpreted Earth's measured diplomatic language as evidence of weakness, because nothing says superior intellects quite like completely missing the point of a warning that was practically gift-wrapped in neon signs. Captain, Murphy announced, I'm receiving multiple transmissions from the Council. The general consensus appears to be that they find our mammalian posturing amusing and our threats empty. Morrison sighed and began composing a second message. Esteemed Council members, Earth would like to clarify our previous transmission. When we mentioned proportional response, we weren't making a threat. We were providing a public service announcement. The difference is important. Sir, Murphy interjected. I feel obligated to point out that they're still not getting it. One more try, Murphy. Attention Galactic Council, Earth has spent considerable effort developing what we call inside voices for interstellar diplomacy. We do this because our outside voices tend to leave crater-shaped impressions on people's homeworlds. We thought you'd appreciate the heads up. The final response from the Council was brief and to the point. Humans are clearly incapable of backing up their rhetoric with action. We look forward to demonstrating the futility of resistance. Morrison looked at the message for a long moment, then turned to his communications officer. Send one last transmission to the Council. What should it say, sir? Morrison smiled, and it wasn't a particularly friendly expression. Tell them we appreciate their feedback, and will be sure to take their concerns under advisement. Then add a postscript. You have been warned. What happens next is educational. As the transmission went out, Murphy's voice took on what could only be described as a tone of professional interest. Captain, should I begin calculating casualty projections for the Galactic Council forces? Why would you do that, Murphy? Well, sir, based on historical precedent, they're about to discover why Earth considers this ship's name to be a form of dark humor. Admiral Vextock's grand plan for demonstrating galactic superiority involved what he called a minor disciplinary action against the human mining colony on Kepler 438b. It was the kind of plan that sounds brilliant when you're surrounded by yes beings who think challenging apex predators is a reasonable career move. The colony itself was a fairly typical human operation. A few thousand miners, some heavy equipment, and enough defensive systems to hold off the occasional space pirate or overly aggressive asteroid. What it didn't have, according to Vextock's intelligence reports, was any significant military presence. This was technically true, if you ignored the fact that humans had a rather flexible definition of what constituted military equipment. Lieutenant Rosa Valdez was having a perfectly normal day blowing up rocks in the name of mineral extraction when her communication array started screaming about incoming hostiles. Rosa had 2 engineering degrees, a certificate in controlled demolitions, and what her commanding officer diplomatically referred to as enthusiasm management challenges. In practical terms, this meant she was very good at making things explode and had strong opinions about people who interrupted her work. Mining control. This is Demo Team 7. Rosa called over the comm, watching her sensors light up with approaching ships. We've got uninvited guests heading our way, and they're not broadcasting friendly intentions. The response came back with the kind of calm that should have been a warning sign to anyone familiar with human behavior under pressure. Copy that. Demo Team 7. You are authorized to defend the mining operation using all available resources. Repeat, all available resources. Rosa grinned, and it was the kind of expression that usually preceded someone learning valuable lessons about the difference between mining equipment and military hardware. Copy that. Control, all available resources it is. The Galactic Council's task force arrived in system with the pomp and circumstance of a species that had never encountered humans in a bad mood. Admiral Vextock's flagship, the Inevitable Victory, dropped out of hyperspace along with a dozen smaller vessels, all bristling with what the Admiral considered impressive firepower. Attention human colony, Vextock transmitted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had clearly never been on the receiving end of human creativity. You will cease all operations and surrender immediately. This is a demonstration of Galactic Council authority. Resistance is futile. The response came back almost immediately. and it was delivered in the kind of cheerful tone that humans used when they were about to do something spectacular and probably inadvisable. "This is Lieutenant Rosa Valdez, Acting Colony Defense Coordinator. We appreciate your interest in our mining operation, but we're going to have to decline your kind offer to surrender. You have 30 seconds to reconsider," Vexstock replied, clearly expecting the kind of immediate capitulation that comes from overwhelming force. "Counter-offer," Rosa transmitted back. "You have 30 seconds to reconsider your life choices, because we're about to demonstrate why humans put warning labels on mining equipment." That should have been the moment when Admiral Vexstock realized he might have made a tactical error. Instead, he gave the order to open fire on what he assumed was a lightly defended mining colony with delusions of adequacy. The first salvo from the Galactic Council forces was precisely targeted, methodically planned, and executed with the kind of military precision that looked impressive on tactical displays. It was also completely ineffective, because Rosa and her team had spent the last 30 seconds activating what humans called mining protocols, and what everyone else was about to learn was a euphemism for creative applications of industrial explosives. The colony's response was immediate, overwhelming, and educational in ways that weren't covered in any galactic military academy. What Vexstock had assumed were mining charges turned out to be mining charges, technically speaking. He had just failed to appreciate that humans had a tendency to over-engineer their mining equipment to handle things like asteroid belts, unstable planetary cores, and apparently hostile alien fleets. "Mining control," Rosa called out cheerfully as her sensors registered multiple direct hits on the attacking ships. "Targets are responding well to percussive maintenance. Requesting permission to increase yield." "Permission granted, Demo Team 7. Show them what a proportional response looks like." The second wave of mining charges lit up the void between the planet and Vexstock's fleet with the kind of spectacular display that typically required significant portions of a star to achieve. The Admiral watched in growing horror as his carefully planned military demonstration turned into what humans would later describe as a learning experience, and what military historians would record as an object lesson in why you don't pick fights with species that mine black holes for fun. "Sir," his tactical officer reported in the kind of voice reserved for delivering very bad news, "our intelligence reports may have contained some inaccuracies regarding human defensive capabilities." Admiral Vexstock stared at his tactical display, watching his superior firepower get systematically dismantled by what were supposedly civilian mining tools. "What kind of inaccuracies?" "Well, sir, it appears their mining equipment is somewhat more robust than we anticipated." That was when Rosa's voice came over the communications array one more time, still maintaining that cheerful tone that was becoming increasingly ominous. "Admiral Vexstock, this is Lieutenant Valdez. We've completed our demonstration of standard mining protocols. Would you like to see what happens when we switch to deep core excavation mode? Or would you prefer to continue this conversation from a safe distance? Say, maybe another star system?" Admiral Vexstock stared at his tactical display with the kind of expression typically reserved for people who've just realized they've accidentally declared war on a natural disaster. Half his fleet was either disabled, retreating, or sending very polite requests to be transferred to less explosive sectors of space. "Sir," his communications officer announced with the kind of professional calm that comes from rigorous military training and a healthy dose of panic, "we're receiving an emergency transmission from the Galactic Council." The holographic display flickered to life, revealing Counselor Pippin in what could generously be described as a state of diplomatic distress. Her translucent form was rippling with colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrum, which was the jellyfish equivalent of having a complete nervous breakdown in public. "Admiral," she began, her voice carrying the kind of urgency usually reserved for planetary evacuation orders, "what exactly is happening at the human colony? Our sensors are detecting energy signatures that are theoretically impossible." Vexstock cleared his throat, which was a complicated process involving 3 different vocal sacs and a significant amount of denial. "The humans appear to have more advanced defensive capabilities than our intelligence suggested." "Advanced?" Pippin's form pulsed with indignation. "Admiral, they just turned one of your destroyers into what my science team is calling a very expensive fireworks display. What kind of mining equipment does that?" "The effective kind, apparently," Vexstock muttered, watching another of his ships limping away from the planet at maximum safe distance. Meanwhile, aboard the Reasonable Response, Captain Morrison was monitoring the situation with the kind of professional interest that comes from watching a slow-motion disaster unfold exactly as predicted. Murphy, ever helpful, was providing running commentary on the proceedings. "Captain," Murphy announced cheerfully, "Lieutenant Valdez has just transmitted a request for additional mining supplies. Specifically, she's asking for access to what she calls the fun stuff from the Deep Space Mining Division." Morrison raised an eyebrow. What exactly constitutes the fun stuff in Rosa's vocabulary? Well, sir, based on her requisition list, she's requesting access to equipment typically used for asteroid belt demolition, neutron star surface mining, and something called aggressive planetary restructuring. I believe the technical term for this equipment category is why we have treaties. And what did Earth Command say? Admiral Hayes approved the request with a note that says, and I quote, "Educational opportunities should be maximized for the benefit of all parties involved." Back on Kepler 438b, Rosa was reviewing her new equipment manifest with the enthusiasm of a child on Christmas morning, if Christmas involved industrial-grade weapons of mass excavation. Her communication array crackled to life with another transmission from Admiral Vexa Toke. "Lieutenant Valdez," the Admiral began, his voice carrying a note of what might have been desperation. "Surely we can resolve this misunderstanding through negotiation." "Oh, we're way past misunderstanding, Admiral," Rosa replied cheerfully. "You see, you interrupted my work schedule, damaged some of our equipment, and apparently think humans respond well to threats. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a learning opportunity." "A learning opportunity," Vexa Toke repeated, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was beginning to understand why humans were considered dangerous. "Absolutely. Today's lesson is about the difference between human restraint and human capability. So far, you've experienced our restraint. Would you like a demonstration of our capability?" Murphy's voice cut into the conversation from the reasonable response. "Admiral Vexa Toke, this is Murphy, an Earth Defense AI. I've been running some calculations that you might find interesting." "What kind of calculations?" Vexa Toke asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. "Well, based on current tactical data, your fleet has approximately 17 minutes and 34 seconds before Lieutenant Valdez finishes calibrating her new equipment. After that, I calculate your chances of survival at roughly 0.003%. That seems oddly specific," Vexa Toke observed. "The 0.003% accounts for the possibility that you might survive long enough to send a distress signal," Murphy explained helpfully. "Though I should mention that our communication jamming protocols are quite comprehensive." Captain Morrison's voice joined the conversation, carrying the kind of reasonable tone that somehow made everything sound worse. "Admiral, Earth is still interested in a peaceful resolution to this situation. All you need to do is withdraw your forces and we can pretend this never happened." "And if we don't?" Vexa Toke asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Then Lieutenant Valdez gets to test her new equipment, and the rest of the galaxy gets a very clear demonstration of why humans have been trying so hard to be diplomatic." Morrison replied, "Trust me, Admiral, you really don't want to see what happens when we stop being nice." Admiral Vexa Toke looked at his tactical display one more time, where his remaining ships were maintaining what could charitably be called a strategic distance from the planet. His communications officer was receiving increasingly panicked reports from the Galactic Council, demanding explanations for how a simple disciplinary action had turned into what appeared to be a military disaster. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "Lieutenant Valdez is powering up something called a deep core restructuring array. Our sensors can't even classify the energy signature." That was when Admiral Vexa Toke finally understood what humans meant when they talked about restraint. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't an inability to fight. It was a conscious choice to avoid demonstrating exactly how creative humans could get when someone really annoyed them. "Communications," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just learned a very expensive lesson. "Patch me through to the Galactic Council, emergency session. And make sure they understand that we may have significantly underestimated the human capacity for creative problem solving." The emergency Galactic Council session convened in what could politely be described as absolute chaos, and more accurately as the kind of panic usually reserved for discovering your planet is about to be eaten by a black hole. Representatives from across the galaxy were simultaneously talking, shouting, and making whatever noise their species produced when experiencing existential dread. Admiral Vextek appeared on the holographic display looking like someone who had just stared into the abyss and discovered it was staring back with a mining laser. "Esteemed council members," he began, his usual military bearing replaced by something that resembled shell shock, "I need to provide an immediate tactical update on the human situation." "Get to the point, Admiral," snapped Representative Glorbex, whose potato-like form was vibrating with what might have been anger or terror. "Our sensors are detecting energy signatures from the human colony that are causing our astrophysicists to question the fundamental laws of physics." Vextek's mandibles clicked nervously. "The humans have begun what they call Phase 2 of their educational demonstration. I believe we may have misunderstood their approach to conflict resolution." "Misunderstood how?" Counselor Pippin demanded, her translucent form now cycling through colors that didn't have names in most languages. "Well," Vextek began carefully. It appears that when humans said they were operating under a policy of restraint, they weren't referring to limitations in their military capabilities. They were referring to their policy of not using those capabilities unless absolutely necessary. The silence that followed was the kind typically experienced in vacuum, which was ironically where several council members were beginning to think they might be safer. Back on Kepler 438b, Lieutenant Rosa Valdez was having the time of her life. Her new equipment had arrived via emergency supply drop, and she was currently interfacing with what Earth Command euphemistically called specialized mining apparatus, and what the rest of the galaxy was about to learn was why humans put warning labels on everything. Mining control, Rosa called cheerfully over the comm. I've got the deep core restructuring array online, and I have to say, the targeting system on this thing is absolutely beautiful. I can precision target individual molecules if I need to. Copy that, Demo Team 7, came the response from Mining Control, where the duty officer was watching his sensors with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. You are cleared to demonstrate appropriate mining techniques to our guests. Rosa's grin was the kind that would have sent Admiral Vextuk's remaining fleet into immediate retreat if they could have seen it. Roger that, Control. Commencing educational demonstration now. The deep core restructuring array was designed for the kind of mining operations that required reshaping entire asteroid belts, which meant it could do things to matter that violated several international treaties and at least 3 laws of thermodynamics. When Rosa fired it up to what she considerately referred to as demonstration mode, the results were immediately visible across several star systems. Admiral Vextuk watched in horror as space itself seemed to fold around the human colony. Reality bending in ways that made his tactical officers start praying to deities they'd previously considered mythological. What in the name of all that's holy are they doing down there? His science officer, who had been running increasingly frantic calculations, looked up from his instruments with the expression of someone who had just discovered mathematics was optional. Sir, they appear to be using controlled gravitational manipulation to restructure local space-time. The energy requirements alone should be impossible. Should be impossible, Vextuk demanded. Well, sir, it turns out that when humans say something is impossible, they mean it's really difficult, and they haven't figured out how to do it safely yet. This appears to fall into the category of things they've figured out how to do, but probably shouldn't. Meanwhile, Captain Morrison was monitoring the situation from the reasonable response with the kind of professional calm that comes from knowing your species has turned over engineering into an art form. Murphy, as always, was providing helpful commentary. Captain, Murphy announced, Lieutenant Valdez has successfully demonstrated selective gravitational restructuring. The Galactic Council fleet is currently experiencing what I believe humans would call significant emotional distress. Any casualties, Murphy? None so far, sir. Lieutenant Valdez is being very careful to avoid permanent damage. She's treating this as what she calls percussive education. Though I should mention that 3 of the alien ships appear to have spontaneously surrendered, and 1 has requested asylum. Morrison opened a communication channel to the Galactic Council emergency session, where the chaos had reached new levels of creative panic. Esteemed Council members, this is Captain Morrison of the Earth Defense Force. I understand you're currently observing our mining demonstration. Mining demonstration. Piprin's voice reached frequencies that most species couldn't hear. Captain, your people are weaponizing space-time itself. Oh, that's not weaponizing. Morrison replied cheerfully. That's just standard deep space mining technique. We use it for extracting resources from neutron star cores. Would you like to see what our actual weapons can do? The silence that followed was so complete that several species' communication equipment began running self-diagnostics, convinced they had stopped working. Captain Morrison. Admiral Vextuk's voice finally broke the silence, carrying the tone of someone who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a very deep cliff. What would it take for Earth to consider this matter resolved? Morrison's response was delivered with the kind of reasonable tone that made it somehow more terrifying. Well, Admiral, Earth has always been committed to peaceful coexistence. All we've ever asked for is to be left alone to pursue our own interests without interference. It's really quite simple. And if the Council agrees to these terms, then Lieutenant Valdez powers down her equipment, we all go back to our respective corners of the galaxy, and we pretend this conversation never happened. Easy. And if we don't agree? Captain Morrison paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet certainty that made civilizations reconsider their life choices. Then, Admiral, you get to discover why Lieutenant Valdez considers what she's doing right now to be the gentle option. And trust me, after 30 centuries of human military development, our definition of gentle has become somewhat relative. Admiral Vextek looked at his tactical display one last time, where Lieutenant Valdez's mining equipment was casually bending the laws of physics into pretzel shapes, while his fleet watched from what they desperately hoped was a safe distance. Council members, he announced with the resigned tone of someone who had just learned why humans were considered dangerous. I believe it's time we voted on a new approach to human relations.
The vote was unanimous, which was remarkable, considering that the Galactic Council had never agreed on anything more complicated than what to call their lunch breaks. The resolution, officially titled The Comprehensive Re-Evaluation of Human Diplomatic Status and the Immediate Implementation of Mutual Non-Interference Protocols, was more commonly known as the We're Really Sorry We Bothered You Please Don't Hurt Us Treaty. Admiral Vextok found himself in the unusual position of delivering an official apology to a species he had attempted to intimidate less than 6 hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he was trying very hard not to think about it because every time he did, his compound eyes started twitching. "Captain Morrison," he began, his voice carrying the kind of formal dignity that comes from eating a substantial helping of humble pie, "the Galactic Council wishes to extend its sincere apologies for any misunderstanding regarding our previous communications. We may have acted hastily in our assessment of the situation." Captain Morrison's response was delivered with the gracious tone of someone who had just watched his subordinate casually rearrange local physics and was feeling magnanimous about it. "No harm done, Admiral. These things happen when there are communication barriers between species. We're just glad we could clear up any confusion about Earth's defensive capabilities." "Defensive capabilities," Vextok repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them somewhat bitter. "Yes, we seem to have misunderstood the scope of those capabilities." Down on Kepler 438b, Lieutenant Rosa Valdez was in the process of powering down her equipment, though she was taking her time about it because, as she explained to Mining Control, it's important to follow proper shutdown procedures when you're dealing with weaponized space-time. Safety first, you know. The fact that she referred to reality-bending mining equipment as requiring safety protocols was not lost on the Galactic Council's monitoring teams, who were frantically updating their files on human technological capabilities. Previous assessments that had classified humans as moderately advanced with delusions of adequacy were being hastily revised to significantly more advanced than advisable with a concerning enthusiasm for making the impossible look routine. "Captain Morrison," Counselor Piperon's voice joined the conversation, her translucent form having settled into colors that suggested relief mixed with ongoing concern. "The Council would like to discuss the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with Earth. We believe there may have been some miscommunications in our previous interactions." "We'd be happy to discuss formal relations," Morrison replied cheerfully. "Earth has always been interested in peaceful cooperation with our galactic neighbors. We just prefer to conduct our negotiations from a position of mutual respect rather than under threat of invasion." Murphy chose that moment to provide one of his helpful observations. "Counselor, if I may add some context to these proceedings, Earth's diplomatic philosophy is based on what humans call the Golden Rule. We treat others as we would like to be treated, which generally involves not attempting to conquer each other's territories. And how does Earth respond when others don't follow this philosophy?" Admiral Vextok asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Well, Admiral," Murphy replied with the cheerful tone of an AI who had access to several thousand years of human military history, "humans have developed what we call educational protocols for those situations. Today's demonstration was actually quite restrained by historical standards." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of implications that made entire civilizations reconsider their foreign policy approaches. Representative Glorbex, whose potato-like form had stopped vibrating sometime during Rosa's demonstration, finally managed to speak. "What would constitute a less restrained demonstration?" he asked, though his tone suggested he immediately regretted the question. Captain Morrison's laugh was genuinely warm and completely terrifying. "Oh, you really don't want to know that? Let's just say that Lieutenant Valdez's mining equipment falls into the category of things we use when we're trying to be polite. Our actual military hardware is significantly less subtle." "Less subtle than manipulating space-time?" Piperon asked faintly. "Counselor," Morrison replied with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow child, "Rosa was using precision instruments designed for delicate resource extraction. Our military equipment is designed for what we politely call comprehensive problem resolution. The difference is roughly equivalent to the difference between a scalpel and a sledgehammer, if the sledgehammer was made of antimatter and had attitude problems." Admiral Vextok looked at his remaining fleet, which was maintaining what could generously be called a strategic distance from anything involving humans, and made a command decision that would define the rest of his career. "Captain Morrison," he announced formally, "the Galactic Council hereby appoints you as our official liaison for all human-related diplomatic affairs. We believe your species' unique perspective on conflict resolution could be valuable in maintaining galactic peace." "What exactly does that position entail?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already had a pretty good idea. "Essentially," Vextalk explained with the resigned tone of someone who had just realized he was about to make humans someone else's problem, "whenever the Council encounters a situation that requires creative problem-solving, we call you. In return, Earth gets full autonomy over its territories and the Council's official recognition as a sovereign power not to be interfered with under any circumstances." "And what happens if someone doesn't follow those guidelines?" Then Vextalk said with the voice of someone who had learned a very expensive lesson, "They get to experience their own educational demonstration, and we all learn something new about the upper limits of human patience." Captain Morrison considered this for a moment, then smiled with the kind of expression that suggested he was already looking forward to his new position. "Admiral, I think that sounds like a perfectly reasonable arrangement. Earth accepts the position of Galactic Peace Enforcement Coordinator." "Peace Enforcement Coordinator," Piperin repeated. "Well," Morrison explained cheerfully, "Earth has always believed that peace is a wonderful thing, and sometimes it just needs a little enforcing to help it along. We're very good at that sort of thing." Murphy's final observation came with the tone of an AI who had just watched his species accidentally conquer the galaxy through aggressive diplomacy. "Captain, I feel obligated to point out that Earth has just been officially appointed to police the entire Galactic Council." "Yes, Murphy, I noticed that too. Should I begin drafting new protocols for what humans consider proportional response in a law enforcement context?" Captain Morrison looked out at the stars, where the Galactic Council fleet was already beginning its retreat to what they hoped was a safe distance, and smiled. "Better make it a comprehensive manual, Murphy. Something tells me we're going to be very busy explaining the difference between human restraint and human capability to a lot of different species. And that, as Murphy would later note in his historical records, was how humanity accidentally became the galaxy's unofficial peacekeeping force through the simple expedient of being polite, reasonable, and absolutely terrifying when properly motivated. The Galactic Council's attempt to demonstrate their authority had instead resulted in them accidentally appointing humans as the galaxy's designated adults, a position Earth would fulfill with characteristic enthusiasm, and a concerning amount of creativity. After all, as Lieutenant Rosa Valdez observed while packing up her mining equipment, there's nothing quite like a good educational demonstration to help foster better interspecies understanding. And if the lesson happened to involve bending the fundamental forces of the universe into pretzel shapes, well, that just made the learning experience more memorable for everyone involved.